All right, welcome back, committee members, and we will now consider the estimates and supplementary estimates number 2 for the Ministry of Environment. And we will begin with vote 26, Environment Central Management and Services subvote EN01. Minister Tallis here with her officials, and officials, the first time you speak at the mic, mention your names and your positions, and Hansard will turn the mics on for you. Minister Tell, you can begin by introducing who has joined you here this evening and then provide your opening remarks.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad you reminded me that I don't have to touch the mic. I was just talking about that because if I have to apologize to Hansard because I will just continue hitting it. You know, I don't learn, right? Yeah. Huh? I'm not apologizing to you. Anyway, good evening, everyone. Beside me is Aaron Worth. With the ministry, and of course Deputy Minister Veronica Gallowitz. And it's great to be here with you. Well, not you. Great to be here. No, I'm pleased to be here today to present some of the important initiatives that are supported by the 24-20.
Officials that have joined you just for the purposes of Hansard to know who is here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, God.
Sorry.
Huh? Are they there? Oh, they have a list for me. That's good. I mean, I refer to these people all the time as by their first name, right? So anyway, sitting right there in a key spot is Wes Kodak, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Environmental Protection Division. Beside him is Rebecca Gibbons, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Corporate Services and Policy Division. And Aaron is, of course, sitting here, and he's the Exec Director of Climate Resilience Branch. And Kevin Murphy is sitting right here, and he's the Assistant Deputy Minister of Resource Management Division. And we have Kenneth Cotterill, my Chief of Staff. Anyway, okay. Now that we've got through all that, as Minister of Environment, I'm proud of the Ministry's commitment to managing the province's environmental health. Through innovative strategies, the Ministry aims to responsibly manage Saskatchewan's environment, drive innovation, and bolster economic growth. The Ministry's proposed 24-25 expense budget is $234.9 million, an increase of more than 146%. This reflects an additional $140 million for clean electricity projects to support our transition to a net zero emissions electricity grid by 2050. This year's budget invests in clean energy, supports conservation, and enhances Crown land management. This allows our government to provide the programs and services that Saskatchewan people need and deserve. I'll take a moment to share some detail on some of these initiatives now. Climate resilience and OBPS. Prairie Resilience, a Made in Saskatchewan climate change strategy, is a government-wide approach to respond to the impacts of climate change. The strategy employs natural systems and technological innovation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while protecting our competitiveness, prioritizing affordability, and enhancing sustainable growth and development. Saskatchewan's Output-Based Performance Standards Program, or OBPS, is a key component of the province's climate change approach. Under Prairie Resilience, the OBPS program requires reductions in emissions intensity across most economic sectors, along with a technology fund to support industry's adaptation of technologies and practices that reduce GHG emissions intensity. As such, the province will retain full policy autonomy concerning how it prioritizes clean electricity transition investments to ensure that Saskatchewan has a reliable, affordable, and net zero emissions power grid by 2050. The electricity sector in Saskatchewan is now part of the province's OBPS program. Despite this change, Saskatchewan is committed to a well-managed clean electricity transition to net zero emissions by 2050, ensuring reliability and affordability are always the foremost considerations in setting provincial electricity policy. To assist in the transition, the province has established 2 new methods of allocating electricity sector revenues into the General Revenue Fund: the Small Modular Reactor Investment Fund and the Clean Electricity Transition Grant. All OBPS compliance payments from the industrial and resource sectors will continue to be deposited into the Saskatchewan Technology Fund, which will provide grants for industry-driven projects that reduce, sequester, or capture emissions. The Technology Fund enables the return of compliance payments to regulated emitters through a competitive application-based intake process. There is currently $25 million available in the Technology Fund, which was allocated from regulated emitters in 2019 and 2020. This program is administered by Innovation Saskatchewan and received 20 expressions of interest during its inaugural intake period, which took place late last year. The fund is great news for Saskatchewan industry. It demonstrates Saskatchewan's ability to push back against federal government's national targets for greenhouse gas reductions. The Technology Fund will help make that happen, and we expect to be able to make our first funding announcements this fall. Our government recently launched the Sustainable Saskatchewan campaign. This campaign draws attention to the role Saskatchewan is playing in providing the world with sustainable products, food, fuel, and fertilizer. Through sustainable land use practices, progressive environmental regulations, and innovative technology, Saskatchewan is strengthening its resilience to climate change while becoming a world leader in sustainable economic development and environmental stewardship. Our climate change strategy is a balanced and measured approach that contributes to global efforts to address climate change while growing our economy to the benefit of current and future generations. Managing our forests is key to growing our economy and managing the health of the environment. Forestry is Northern Saskatchewan's largest sector and the backbone of our northern communities. The northern forestry sector supports families and communities with nearly 8,000 jobs and hundreds of businesses, both of which are by far the highest proportion of any province in Canada. A great number of people employed in the forest industry in Saskatchewan are Indigenous. It is a point of pride for our government, for our people, to have such excellent Indigenous representation in one of our more critical economic sectors. The growth plan includes the goal to double the growth of Saskatchewan's forestry sector. To support this work, the ministry will spend an additional $400,000 again this year to accelerate the Forest Resource Inventory project. It will provide high-quality information about forest resources that will ultimately help grow Saskatchewan's forest sector. Like the Forest Industry Resource Project, a timber scaling system is critical to measuring and collecting dues from the forestry industry. Saskatchewan's current timber scaling and harvesting information system is running on outdated software with limited technical support and is at the end of its lifespan. Timber scaling is a method for measuring forest products to determine volumes to access Crown timber dues and renewal fees. This system will modernize the digital service so the forest industry can interact with the government as they have been asking for. In addition to the forestry sector, the provincial economy depends heavily on natural resource industries. This allows our industry partners to operate and grow while also enhancing environmental outcomes for the province. In response to the government's critical mineral and investment attraction strategies and anticipated workload growth, the ministry is investing $620,000 to improve the capacity to manage Crown resource land use. This includes additional staff for our lands branch, improving capacity to provide appropriate and timely review of project submissions, and to incorporate mitigation measures to reduce potential environmental impacts. Additionally, the ministry's budget includes $225,000 for the Protected and Conserved Areas Network Program and an increase of $600,000, hang on a minute, $500,000 for continued woodland caribou range planning. The ministry's approach in these programs involves collaboratively designing regulatory tools, engaging industry partners, and working with Indigenous communities to achieve our environmental outcomes, while also remaining vigilant in our efforts to conserve the diverse species in our province. Protected and conserved areas safeguard ecosystems, wildlife habitat, and species at risk. They help us in numerous ways, including mitigating the effects of climate change and supporting tourism and recreation. They also provide valuable opportunities for reconciliation and renewed relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. We are also working with industry so we can identify opportunities to support sustainable mineral exploration in Saskatchewan. Investing in natural resource industries are instrumental to the economic growth of this province. We continue to have initiatives supported by Saskatchewan Fish and Wildlife Development Fund. This fund was developed to manage, preserve, and enhance fish and wildlife habitat in Saskatchewan. The fund has 3 fish and wildlife management goals: maintain natural habitat through conservation, biodiversity, land management, and awareness of rare species; maintain and grow sustainable fish populations and fish habitat; and maintain game populations and ensure accessible hunting. We encourage and fund cooperative projects with local volunteer interest groups that may involve planting trees and cleaning away old buildings, machinery, and fences. 30% of the revenue from all hunting, angling, and trapping license sales is contributed to the fund. And this year, due to anticipated number of licensed sales, we are increasing our support to the fund by $307,000. Wildlife and game population are major parts of our natural resources belonging to all Saskatchewan people. The ministry manages game population and works to maintain sustainable game populations. Working with our Indigenous partners to blend traditional knowledge with science-based data has been a key component for managing our wildlife populations. Part of how we do that is through ground-based surveys. In recent years, we've invited Indigenous community members along on our ground-based surveys. It's been an excellent exchange of ideas and knowledge and is becoming a key piece of our ground surveys. Aerial surveys are also critical in gaining the best possible information on wildlife populations. These surveys are used to monitor elk and deer populations in areas where landowners and producers are experiencing damage to their land and crop. This year's budget includes investments to expand the regular aerial survey program, which will help us manage elk and deer populations through more effective policies and management plans. The expanded surveillance program will let wildlife managers refine hunting license allocations with the intent to see a reduction to Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation wildlife damage claims. We continue to implement our solid waste management strategy, recognizing the critical role waste management plays in protecting the environment and public health. It is a strategy that protects the environment and promotes economic development and innovation. This year, we will be undertaking the year 5 review of the solid waste management strategy. We want to ensure that our approach to solid waste management continues to effectively address environmental concerns and the evolving needs and priorities of communities and stakeholders. We will continue to work with Indigenous Services Canada and the Ministry of Government Relations on the development of northern regional landfills to improve waste diversion and environmental protection. And we will be exploring a Saskatchewan Environmental Code chapter for composting facilities. This will help to protect against adverse effects resulting from improper management at these sites, while simultaneously streamlining requirements and enhancing operational efficiency. Through this review, the ministry will consider new regulations and code applying to municipal, private, and industrial landfills and replacing the municipal refuse management regulations. Maintaining and improving air quality is crucial to achieving the Ministry of Environment's goal of safe communities and healthy environments. To ensure everyone can access air quality data, we must collect it using scientifically reliable methods. This year, we will employ a rapid air quality monitoring system to increase the ministry's year-round capacity to respond to high-priority situations on short notice. We proposed capital funding to purchase a new trailer to replace the rapid deployment air monitoring station and the required analyzers for air quality monitoring and compliance, air quality monitoring and compliance throughout the province. This will accommodate and adequately house a larger suite of parameters. The current mobile air quality station runs in a small trailer, which means it can only carry minimal equipment. The current mobile station monitors air quality in wildfire areas and air zone management. The ministry is seeing an increase in the need to support industrial air quality management, which requires the capacity to measure different or more parameters in all 4 seasons. The ministry will also enhance surveillance for emerging wildlife disease threats and disposal of chronic wasting disease. This includes targeted testing to help manage the disease. We've heard from hunters they're concerned about the turnaround time for CWD results. On average, it takes 4 to 6 weeks. The Ministries of Environment, Health and Agriculture want to make CWD testing and carcass disposal as easy as possible. Another important component of natural resource sustainability is on the aquatic species, invasive species front. Zebra mussels are present in neighboring jurisdictions, including Manitoba, North Dakota, and Montana. To prevent entry of aquatic invasive species into the province, the ministry operates watercraft inspection stations along our eastern and southern borders. We also partner with provincial agencies and non-governmental organizations to monitor more than 130 water bodies annually for high-risk aquatic invasive species. In addition, we operate mobile decontamination stations throughout the province where we educate the public on how to clean, drain, and dry their watercraft. In our public education campaign this year, we have an enhanced focus on all water equipment, not just boats. Every water user in Saskatchewan has a responsibility to clean, dry, and drain their gear, whether it's fishing tackle, paddle boards, or even their floaties and water toys. Through the work of the ministry, we will educate and inform the public so we can keep our water bodies free from the risk of invasive species. The ministry is continuing work to reduce the environmental impact of abandoned non-uranium mine sites. The ministry is working to promote our impacted sites fund to our municipal partners. The fund was established to provide municipalities with some financial support to address orphaned, environmentally impacted sites, creating economic and social development opportunities. The program is funded from fines collected from when an infraction occurs under the Environmental Management and Protection Act of 2010. Just last year, the town of Shaunavon was the first recipient of the funds. They received more than $70,000 to complete 2 phases of site assessments at a former car dealership. This program is a great example of leveraging penalties into environmental health. The work we have presented today is only the beginning, and we believe these measures will help us achieve our goals and create a better future for all citizens of Saskatchewan. I'd like to thank the Committee on the Economy for your attention and support, and look forward to your questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Minister. I will now open the floor to questions from committee members and recognize Mr. Clark.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister, and to all your civil servants here tonight. Looking forward to a good conversation. I'll get right into it. The Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society has recently released a report card on protected areas called Building Momentum, a progress report on Canada's nature protection targets. In it, Saskatchewan appears to be failing to protect and conserve areas for biodiversity. The province's goal is 12%. I think we currently sit at 9.9%. I'm wondering, how does the Ministry of Environment intend to meet this goal of 12% protected area by 2025?
Murphy is joining us here to get into the details of the plan and the template that we are using to reach the targeted, our targets through a number of initiatives. And I'll turn it over to Kevin. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Minister. Kevin Murphy, Assistant Deputy Minister of our Resource Management Division. Thanks. So as the Minister mentioned, Saskatchewan has a roadmap to reach that 12% target. This last year, we undertook a redesignation of a number of our grasslands, mainly pastures that are held by either agricultural organizations or the Ministry of Agriculture, to recognize them as what's called an Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measure, an OECM. An OECM designation, or recognition more to the point, is different from a designation under the environmental action, like a protected area is traditionally considered. OECMs are a categorization that allows continued compatible utilization for economic purposes on the landscape. So in this particular instance with the grasslands, that continues with ranching, grazing practices. That was a first step in familiarizing our stakeholders and our land stewards with that kind of a recognition of the land base. Using that process that we've started, it's our intention to work with our colleagues in agriculture to continue to list more of our grasslands, to work with our colleagues in the Water Security Agency to look at the potential for listing some of the water bodies in the province, and to work with our own Forest Service to look at designating some more forest lands as OECMs. We believe that using those methods, we're on track to meet our 12% targets in the timeframes expressed in the resiliency plan.
Thank you. The COP15, the biodiversity COP in Montreal, the federal government signed on to 30% conservation goal by 2030. Is this something that the government of Saskatchewan is considering and thinks is worthy of implementing?
Saskatchewan's position with regards to the original inception of our representative areas network and the 12% target that was originally globally agreed to, admittedly, is that one of the precepts of that was to ensure that not only were we protecting areas that were important from a biodiversity perspective or culturally important, but that we were setting up benchmarks against which we could gauge the success of implementation of our regulatory framework on the remainder of the province. It is our position that in order to truly maintain biological diversity, we have to maximize the integrity and the sustainability of the entirety of the province. And the ecological reserves, the representative areas network, and now the protected and conserved areas network was established to help us gauge how those practices, the management practices, the stewardship of the land base is being successful. We consider that that is a part of the overall biological diversity protection framework that's part of the work that even the COP process has adhered to. There's a number of other actions beyond just the protected areas piece. The 30% protected areas target for us is difficult because in some cases it's arbitrary. Our original program was intended to get 12% of each of the ecotypes in the province to help us with that benchmarking. The 30% target is actually impossible for us to reach in some of those areas. If we think of the Regina Plain as an example, less than 4% of that is in native condition. We consider our job to be thinking about the other 96% as well as that 4%. And the 30% target, because it's now being lumped for the land base as opposed to an ecotype, is somewhat arbitrary and not something that we're considering important from the overall biodiversity protection program.
Thank you. In goal 2 of the business plan for this budget for the Ministry of Environment does state, sustainable landscapes and wildlife populations that are resilient and biologically diverse. I want to shift gears a little bit, but staying with the protected areas piece. Water Security Agency is, in recent consultations and presentations to stakeholders, has proposed an agricultural water stewardship program that will promote the drainage of wetlands for economic growth. The current draft shows that the policy would allow up to 50% of wetlands to be drained in any given drainage project or any given wetland area. And I'm wondering, how does that fit to let 50% of wetlands disappear off the landscape at the same time as trying to protect 12% of the various ecosystems that you mentioned, especially in the agricultural zone where currently little protection exists and a lot of those wetlands have already been lost. So I'm wondering, how can we allow Water Security Agency's policy of up to 50% or more drainage to occur while still protecting 12% of the province?
So the planning that Water Security has been doing on its water management framework has been done in consultation with Environment for the overall layout of that strategy. I encourage you to work with Water Security. However, what I can assure you is that they have consulted with us, and there is an expectation that in addition to the overall orderly management of water, which will include some drainage, but will also include just general management of the water bodies and water courses in an area. There isn't an expectation that they work with environment to identify important areas, important key nodes, and important areas from a perspective of not only biological diversity, but for target species like waterfowl, if there's a fisheries target in the area. And then in addition to that, the targets are for around 50%, leaving another 50% on the landscape that is in relative native condition. And it is not the expectation of environment or water security that that level of management will be required across the entirety of the province. That target is being set because there are some areas where they have a larger need to be able to undertake water management because of the conditions, just, a lot of water on the landscape, high rainfall events, flooding concerns, things like that. There's other parts of the province where we have limited expectation of any kinds of drainage or management requirements, drier areas of the province, et cetera.
Thank you. Part of that, the agricultural water stewardship policy data that the WSA is using suggests that 86% of wetlands currently exist on the landscape, which when you talk to landowners or when you talk to many stakeholders is a bit laughable that that number would be suggested as what remains of wetlands on Saskatchewan's landscape. And so the 50%, that's a lot of wetlands being drained. And again, I look at the business plan for the ministry. At what point, the performance measures, what does success look like? Critical habitats are identified and managed to support continued use by sensitive species. Again, reference waterfowl, an economically important group of animals from a hunting perspective to the economy, species at risk, including tiger salamanders and various things. At what point does, the loss of wetlands on the landscape become now a concern because it's becoming an endangered ecosystem?
The target and the mandate set by WSA is by WSA, and you'll have to ask WSA that question.
Thank you, Minister. I do think it's the mandate of the ministry to, protect ecosystems in this province. So I do think it falls under your jurisdiction, but I'll move on. Research from WSA shows that 30% wetland loss, we start to see significant impacts to wildlife at that point. And again, WSA is suggesting that, over 50% of wetlands can be lost. How does this drainage policy support the ministry's game management strategy, the fisheries management strategy, the prairie resilience report, and species at risk management?
So with regards to the question of how WSA is incorporating our values and thresholds, we're still in consultation on a lot of that plan. They haven't released a final version of it, and they're consulting with other stakeholders as well as us to look at things like triggering thresholds. And until they've actually, ratified that, passed it through, I can't speak to exactly how that will come out, but I can state that we're having engagement with them about how we would undertake that work.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've heard from a participant who attended one of the stakeholder meetings recently, and the statement was made that WSA is okay with seeing wildlife populations crash for the sake of wetland drainage, which was shocking to me. The research shows, that drainage or wetlands are important carbon sinks, and as we see, that these ecosystems are moved from the landscape, obviously we would see a release of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from wetlands. As the amount of wetlands drainage increases, how does the ministry intend to offset these new emissions and replace these carbon sinks on the landscape?
Hi, Aaron Worth, the Executive Director of the Climate Resilience Branch of the Ministry of Environment. Thanks for the question. I think it's a fair question to ask about sequestration when it comes to wetlands. For sure, it's something that I know in the Ministry of Environment we're trying to get a better understanding of. I think the emissions data and sequestration data in terms of carbon removals on wetlands has been hard for some of our experts in the Ministry of Environment to verify some of the stuff that's coming out of the National Inventory Report that the federal government produces every year. So we would agree that that's something that we need to continue to look at and see exactly the potential sources or sinks when it comes to wetlands in Saskatchewan to understand that a little bit better. But as far as we've seen so far, we're not seeing necessarily potential for large, that wetlands being a large source of emissions. I think we're seeing large swings already in the existing wetlands. And so, again, that's something that I think we could probably use better data and better science on to better understand and will. But in terms of some of the other stuff we're doing in the province when it comes to sequestration, it's pretty significant. The agricultural sector alone sequesters through ag soils, things like zero tillage, almost as much emissions as it emits as a sector in terms of farming practices and fertilizer and the like. And so that sector is virtually net zero as it stands, and those are world-leading practices in terms of fertilizer management and ag tillage and precision agriculture for our nutrient stewardship. So those are all the things that we want to support in Saskatchewan, and in some cases that means having debates with the federal government when it comes to some of their policies that are curbing some of the offset potential that we have in Saskatchewan. We know that Saskatchewan has one of the largest land bases in the world, and that means for offsets for sequestration, whether that's through biological sequestration or mechanical sequestration. We have lots of pore space potential, CCUS potential, forestry potential, and lots of advantages when it comes to some of our sustainable management practices in the forestry sector. So these are all things that are featured in Prairie Resilience or Climate Change Strategy and under our resilience framework as well, and things that we continue to track. In terms of promoting offsets, we're still, I think, very keen on providing recognition for offset development for project developers, for farmers in Saskatchewan. I think we've been challenged by some recent rules that the federal government has introduced that make it very difficult for us to add offsets to our regulatory program in Saskatchewan, our output-based performance standards program. That's a really great way to provide recognition by allowing offset project developers, farmers, foresters, and the like to make decisions that sequester and remove more carbon from the atmosphere by sequestering it in our soils, and then using that to offset compliance for some of our regulated emitters. So we've seen in other provinces, they've been able to add some of our programs, but when we tried to add some of those into our OBPS program, the federal government had changed the rules and made it impossible for us to add ag soils, for example, as an offset mechanism, a compliance mechanism through offsets through our program. And so we're still encouraged by the potential that there is in Saskatchewan for offset development and for sequestration, and want to continue to encourage that and continue to have lots of conversations with the federal government, trying to advocate for the interests of our farmers and offset developers so that we can increase those amounts like we've seen in the ag sector, which is a really great success story in terms of what that sector has been able to do to offset its emissions.
Thank you. Changing gears slightly, it's my understanding that the ministry has conducted a fine-scale assessment as to what percentage of native prairie exists or remains in Saskatchewan. Can you tell me what is the official number of how much unbroken native prairie remains in the province?
Thanks for the question. The last comprehensive work that was done on a grassland estimate for Saskatchewan was over 2 decades ago, and the work was conducted with what is now considered to be very low resolution satellite imagery, over 30-meter pixels, and therefore, by today's standards, less reliable. Because of that, we're actually in the midst of doing some update work on that, which much better imagery, trying to use tools like artificial intelligence to undertake some of the analysis work for us and ground truthing with the team. And as a result, we don't have a current accurate number for the amount of remaining grassland. It's one of the reasons we're undertaking the work, is to get that figure. We will release that when the work is completed. Unfortunately, I don't have an estimate of how long that will take us because, as I said, some of the tools that we're trying to use to accelerate the interpretation are somewhat new, untested, and need to be ground truthed. So my team has not got an estimate of when we'll complete the work. It will be over the next several years that we're able to complete that. Because of the age of the old product, we don't feel it's necessarily a truly reliable estimate for us, and we no longer use that information to help us as anything other than a rough guide of where target areas might be for the current work.
Thank you. Would the work being done, would that fall under the prairie landscape inventory? Yeah.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
Thank you. What actions is the province taking to address the loss of native prairie in Saskatchewan?
Thanks for the question. We have a variety of tools and practices that help us protect native habitat throughout the province. The environmental assessment process demands that if a development is on native grass, that there either be mitigation for impacts or avoidance, and that's a part of the environmental assessment process. Our regulatory system uses tools like the prairie siting guidelines to ensure that there is a minimization of impact to grasslands and an avoidance of native grass by projects such that it doesn't interfere with those. And we even undertake work on private land to ensure that if there's native prairie, that those siting guidelines are being followed by industry when they're undertaking activities like everything from irrigation projects right through to some of the new helium projects that are taking place in the southwest of the province. In addition to that regulatory framework that the ministry uses for the entirety of our landscape, there's a variety of tools where we have identified grasslands, if they're in provincial holdings, Crown agricultural land, or other types of Crown land throughout the province. We use tools like the Wildlife Habitat Protection Act, regulatory designation, the overall sort of protected areas strategy that we talked about, the recognition through OECMs with our various partners. And we also work with our partner NGO groups, Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Federation, Ducks Unlimited being examples, also the stock growers, to be able to place conservation easements on grasslands where landowners voluntarily accept that. So there's a spectrum of tools all the way from stewardship right through to regulatory requirements that are employed across the landscape.
Thank you. Talking about fish and wildlife development land, how many acres are currently under that designation, and then how many parcels of land would that be?
My apologies, we're struggling to see with the data information that we've got, whether we have the current stats on the tables, and while the staff were able to provide me with the number of parcels, we didn't get the information about the number of hectares for you, so we'll provide you with that information.
Was there any fish and wildlife development land that was removed from that designation in the last calendar year, or the last fiscal year, sorry, so 2023, 2024?
I'm not aware of any Fish and Wildlife Development Fund land that was removed in the last year. Typically, Fish and Wildlife Development Fund is held in perpetuity. There have been some circumstances in the past decade where we have made a trade with landowners for things like access to ensure that it's accessible to our hunting public and other people, bird watchers, et cetera, whoever, that it's available. We've had a few parcels that became isolated over time inside of private lands and were blocked from access, so we made trades to do that, but it's a very rare circumstance where we remove land from the Fish and Wildlife Development Fund holdings.
Thank you. How much money was spent in 2023, 2024 on fencing for fish and wildlife development lands, and how much is budgeted in this budget?
Sorry, I don't have that information available right now from our staff or others.
Would you be able to find that?
We would consider that, yes.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the budget, I'm noticing a minor decrease in the climate resilience line. Can you tell me about that?
Veronica Gelowitz, Deputy Minister. Thank you for the question. There was just a small reorganization, a program moved to another area in the ministry
Would that have been?
for managing the Eastern Athabasca Regional Monitoring Program. We moved it to within the Environmental Protection Division, responsibility for overseeing that.
So it would still be in the Ministry of Environment then?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Also, looking at the budget, environmental protection decreasing by $3,640,000. Would this be from moving conservation officers out of the ministry, or what would the reduction be for that?
So there were a few changes in that subvote. The Sarcan operating grant decreased. It's based on the environmental handling charges received 2 years prior. So that was down about 1.2 million. We have a technology project that is in the final year for 24-25. So that's a decrease that's reflected in environmental protection as well as our contaminated sites. What we intend to spend next year on contaminated sites remediation has decreased.
Okay, thank you. Minister, can you explain why conservation officers were moved out of the ministry and into policing ministry?
That occurred during the 21-22 budget, and that rationale was provided at the time.
Okay. What kind of relationship do conservation officers have with the ministry currently then?
The relationship with the ministry, with conservation officers, has not changed. They still have the regulatory powers that they had before and continue to exercise that duty and responsibility.
Has their responsibilities expanded to include more things like, traffic or violations or those kind of things, radar?
No. The two duties currently, the expanded duties currently undertaken by the conservation officers should be answered by a CPPS. And I mean, it's all of it has been public, but I'll let them answer that question.
Thank you, Minister. Does the ministry track how many contacts conservation officers have with hunters and fishermen?
There's no expectation of contacts being reported, and so they don't. I mean, there are so many ways in which to, when you have contact with someone, but it isn't reported directly to the ministry.
Okay. Just touching on the Lake Diefenbaker project briefly, has any kind of environmental assessment been conducted on that project?
Mr. Clark, that question is probably better directed to Water Security Agency, even though, because they're still in the initial processes of a lot of this, so.
Environmental assessment, is that not the ministry's?
We haven't received a proposal, so there's nothing to report.
Okay. Has the ministry done any modeling or? Okay. Has the ministry done any modeling or forecasting around impacts to the Diefenbaker project? I'm thinking downstream ecosystems, say Cumberland Delta.
That kind of detail would be something we would be looking for in the proposal.
Just to touch on the Cumberland Delta for a second, we all know that this is the largest inland delta in North America, freshwater delta. I think both the minister and I have had the opportunity to explore it on an airboat. Indigenous folks from up in the area are describing how the water flow volumes are really changing over time, especially in the last 50 years because of the dam. And the seasonality of these flows has dramatically changed too. In my time up there in September of this past fall, we're seeing lots of invasive species in terms of Phragmites expanding on the landscape, and then also like just the reduction of water into the delta itself impacting this ecosystem in a big way. Is the province doing anything to kind of mitigate any of the changes that are happening due to the dam? Thinking about water flow, how the river's drying up, a lot of the flow is changing, and less water is coming into the delta.
Those responsibilities are under the WSA, their operational responsibilities. There's no question that environment would be consulted from time to time in that regard, but it is not our function and not our role.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Does the ministry have the most recent numbers on what the 2022 emissions are from electricity generation?
So for the year 2022, SAS Power wasn't required to report to the Ministry of Environment on its emissions. We do regulate SAS Power in terms of a coal-fired equivalency agreement with the federal government, and that's where our regulatory role in SAS Power intersect. But those numbers would have been reported directly to the federal government under the federal output-based pricing system. Going forward, we'll not only be regulating coal-fired electricity from SAS Power, but we'll also be pricing their emissions starting in retroactive January 1, 2023. So we don't have that data with us right now. It's not been officially reported to the Ministry of Environment as yet.
Okay, I asked just because that data appears in Prairie Resilience, right? So just curious if that had been updated. Why doesn't Prairie Resilience report overall emissions for Saskatchewan?
So the concept of Prairie Resilience is resilience, and so we look at not just the climatic impacts of climate change, but also the social and economic impacts. And so when it comes to emissions, we see the most important measure for emissions as being emissions intensity. So in the case of a sector, that would be emissions per unit of output or product, and then for the overall economy, and the sectors in it, emissions per unit of GDP. So that's an important measure for Saskatchewan because we know that we're an export-oriented province. We're the largest per capita exporter in Saskatchewan, and we trade in a lot of commodities, and those commodities in almost all cases are of a lower average emissions intensity than our competitors globally. And so we see that by having programs like the Output-Based Performance Standards program, which focuses on emissions intensity, so again, emissions per unit of product, we're able to continue to produce while lowering our emissions intensity. And the more we produce of those goods, the more they displace higher emissions products, commodities, and other products globally. And so when it comes to fighting climate change, it's important to look at the global atmosphere. There is just one atmosphere. And the overall contribution of the province and all of its sectors in reducing overall global emissions. If we focused more as a performance measure on absolute emissions, I think we would struggle keeping many of our sectors operating sustainably. Right now, we know that our emissions intensity continues to go down. We continue to see a delinking of the emissions required to produce a unit of GDP across the economy. And in our output-based performance standards program, for example, since 2019, we've seen an emissions intensity reduction of more than 3.5%, which is overachieving the goals of the output-based performance standards program. The program would have us reduce our emissions intensity across the sectors that we cover by about 2.4%, and we're at 3.5% reduction. So what we're seeing is production continues to go up. Those goods are sustainably produced, and we're likely going to try to estimate this going forward, but they're displacing higher emissions goods elsewhere. That's overall global emissions reduction, but at the same time, we continue to grow our sectors and the jobs that those sectors support. So that's been our primary focus, emissions intensity from both an economy-wide standpoint and across our emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors.
Thank you. Minister, is it the position of the government that the OBPS program should be scrapped for industry in the private sector?
Thanks for the question. The output-based performance standards program is a tax relief program. And so it's in direct response to the federal backstop, the federal carbon pricing backstop. And it exists to prevent carbon leakage, which is production, jobs, and emissions going to countries with more lax environmental standards. And so the program exists really well. It provides obviously a discount on the federal fuel charge. That's part one of the Carbon Price and Pollution Act. And it allows our companies in Saskatchewan under the OBPS to remain competitive as they reduce their emissions intensity of their facilities gradually and over time, and it gives them an opportunity to recoup some of those costs through the Saskatchewan Technology Fund and buy and sell performance credits or carbon capture and utilization and storage credits. And so the program today works really well, but it exists because of a federal carbon pricing backstop. So, any future decision around the OBPS program, it would really just depend on any changes at the federal level, and then would require the province to revisit the program. Of course, the program, it prices emissions, but it has other aspects to it in terms of different crediting regimes that could potentially stay. So it's bigger than just a pricing program, and those are all future decisions that would have to be taken depending on what happens at different levels, including with respect to the federal carbon pricing benchmark.
Thank you, Mr. Worth. I would like to hear from the minister on this one. Is it the position of the government that the OBPS should be scrapped for industry and the private sector?
The response to that was given at another committee level, and Mr. Worth covered that off fairly extensively about what it is and what we would do. So right now we're dealing with right now. So it's what we are facing today, and it is a carbon tax relief for our industrial emitters. So that's where it is right now, and nothing's changing as of today.
You referenced this question being answered in another committee. Just for clarity, do you know which committee that was?
My understanding was, no, I don't know, but I guess you can look in Hansard. I don't know.
Good question. Does the province have an absolute reduction target for emissions, greenhouse gas emissions?
The answer to your question is no.
Thank you. What role does the ministry play now in fighting fires?
The ministry doesn't have a role in actual firefighting in the province.
Does the ministry engage in monitoring blackleg ticks in the province? I started to, and then I waved it. Steele was here, but I pointed at him.
I get it.
But they tell me that when they were growing up, there were not ticks anywhere.
There was nothing till about 20 years ago.
The ministry helps helps in the monitoring, but we do not maintain, do not do the work ourselves. So it's designated to another agency.
Do you know the numbers for, like, say, how many blackleg ticks were found in the province last year or the last couple of years?
So with regards to that monitoring and monitoring for any kind of zoonotics, we have a program that's cross-government called the One Health. It involves health, environment and agriculture agencies. And when it's specifically dealing with wildlife, we work with the Canadian Cooperative Wildlife Health Centres across Canada, one of which is in Saskatoon. They collaborate with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the federal government's, the Canadian Wildlife Service as well, on monitoring and coordinating. So the data is actually sent to the Canadian Cooperative Wildlife Health Centre. Veterinarians and health officials can utilize that data to help them with their aspects of it. So we're merely sort of facilitating that utilization, and it's the Cooperative Wildlife Health Centre that's maintaining that information.
Yeah, I mean, my concern around blackleg ticks is obviously Lyme disease. You know, if you look at as climate warms, blackleg ticks are able to overwinter in locations where they have not been able to before. If you look at Manitoba, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they did not exist in Manitoba. They were not able to overwinter, and now we see significant populations in a number of locations across southern Manitoba. So they do appear to be marching slowly to our province, and there will be I think significant health implications for Saskatchewan people with Lyme disease being bit by a tick. It's a novel experience to actually contract a disease from a tick bite. So I was just curious whether we're monitoring that, knowing that it's on our doorstep in Manitoba right now. In terms of budget, around the $140 million going to Sask Power for the clean tech, or for clean electricity. Does the ministry have any idea as to how that money is going to be spent? Or does it have any expectations about how that money will be spent? Obviously, I understand it's going to Sask Power, but is there any requirement from the ministry? Christine.
So the ministry is still in process with Sask Power developing the actual agreement. However, there are a few things that Sask Power will be able to use the grant for: clean electricity power purchase agreements, customer clean electricity and demand-side management programs, importing renewable power, and small modular reactor operating costs.
Thank you, Minister. Switching gears again, looking at wildlife, I'm wondering if you could tell me the total number of tags for both over-the-counter tags and draw tags for white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, antelope, and moose for the hunting season in 2023. And I realize that some of those species will not have over-the-counter tags, but that was the easiest way to ask that question.
Sorry, could I just ask for a point of clarification? Are you requesting the number of tags that were sold or the number that were notionally allocated to those species?
Sold.
Sold, okay, thank you.
what we don't have.
Apologies, at my fingertips right now is the revenue, but we can get you the number of sold. We'll endeavor to do that for you.
Okay.
Thank you. So that was for all ungulate species you were asking, I believe?
Yeah.
Okay.
And could I get, my follow-up question was going to be for 2022 as well. Has the ministry seen a decrease in tags? I know you don't have the numbers right in front of you, but perhaps you've looked at the data. Has there been a decrease in tags over the last few years that are being acquired or sold or bought by hunters? Yeah.
So in general, we saw a decline during COVID for everything except resident angling. We're seeing a return to pre-COVID levels in a number of our license sales. For instance, non-resident waterfowl has reached pre-COVID levels again. And we're seeing that trend in a lot of our other resident license sales, ungulates, upland game birds, et cetera, but they have not as of yet returned to pre-COVID levels for those.
What kind of feedback has the ministry received from hunters about concerns accessing land in response to this Ask First no trespassing law?
So with response to hunter concerns about the passage of the Trespass Act, we have heard some concerns expressed, particularly through the Wildlife Federation as an advocacy group on behalf of hunters, that there have been some impediments to access because of the requirement for permission now. And we are working with groups like the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, the Wildlife Federation, even crop insurance in terms of creating better land access opportunities, creating tools that can be available online for hunters to be able to access lands. But we have heard some concerns that it has created a bit of an impediment for some hunters in some areas, yes.
How would the ministry recommend hunters get in contact with a landowner who doesn't live, say, in Saskatchewan, or the land is owned by, a numbered company and there's no information given on who owns that piece of land on, say, an RM map, what advice would you give to hunters?
So the ministry has always expressed an expectation that hunters seek permission to access land even before the changes to the act. So we continue to advocate that the same mechanisms would be used, reaching out through neighbors, reaching out through the rural municipalities and others for contact information. It's understandably a difficult circumstance in some cases if there is a non-resident or other, but we ask that they use the same tools that they were using previously to seek permission for access to land.
Thank you. Do you believe that we've lost the battle on chronic wasting disease in this province?
I think it was there before, but we just didn't do, we never did studies like that 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Testing wasn't done for that stuff 20 years ago.
20 years ago was only depressingly 2004. It's not like the 80s. I have to remind myself of that too.
You don't have to remind me of that, because I, those are the good years.
I should say, it
From
wasn't
what I
the 60s,
remember,
Terry.
from what I remember, the 80s were good, you know. I was in business in 1985.
Do you know what year we were born in, Terry?
I don't want to ask. When you complain about small businesses and that, when I bought mine, I was paying 17.5% interest on my
Yeah.
business.
It's up to 12% right now, which is not 17.5%.
With regards to chronic wasting disease in the province, Canadian Food Inspection Agency has declared the province to be endemic, and we recognize that the opportunity to remove the disease from our landscape has passed. However, we believe that we can continue to control the spread. It's why we have a budget investment for looking at monitoring, ensuring that we can contain the spread of chronic wasting disease from getting into our forested lands, impacting caribou, woodland caribou in particular. So we recognize that there is an endemism to the disease in Saskatchewan that we have to deal with, but we're also still continuing to work on limiting the spread and allowing our various hunting public to be able to check their meat after they've taken a carcass and submit that for sampling.
Thank you. I've only got a few more minutes left for this evening, so I got one more topic I'd like to touch on around air quality. On March 2nd, we had a high-risk designation from Environment and Climate Change Canada in terms of a special air quality statement for Regina, where we saw high levels of nitrogen oxide. What kind of, the province is obviously monitoring this. Can someone explain kind of what happened there that morning in terms of what caused the air quality to hit a high risk category?
Hello, thanks for that question. Wes Kotick, Assistant Deputy Minister, Environmental Protection Division. So regarding the high air quality health index values, in early March, there was, we have a monitoring station in Regina that feeds into the national system that Environment Canada reports. So on that day, what we have noticed that there was a thermal inversion that morning. So it is a weather phenomenon that happens at certain temperatures, certain times of the year. And so that is what happened. It's where the air is trapped and it's not able to disperse like it typically would. But it's not attributed to any one source. So it could be from transportation, because it was high nitrogen oxides as well as particulate matter. So it could be from a number of things, including vehicle emissions, emissions from buildings, et cetera. So that is what we have observed for that incident.
Thank you. Is there modeling that happens at the ministry to predict when a thermal inversion will happen?
We don't do weather forecasting in our ministry, but we can identify, or confirm that has happened once it has. And yeah.
So there's currently nothing in place to kind of predict those weather phenomenon, or it sounded like from your answer before that, this happens with some frequency at certain times of the year potentially. So there's nothing that kind of is predictive in that.
And because they are isolated incidents, and so it's not like a larger widespread area, and there are times where it happens and the monitors may not detect that as well. So there's a number of factors that would result in being high levels of contaminants or not at any given time.
From the business plan, there's a quote here to work with Environment and Climate Change Canada and the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program to develop a new memorandum of understanding for the continued collaboration agreement between parties. Just wondering if you can speak to where that MOU is at.
The agreement with Environment and Climate Change Canada, that's been a long-standing agreement, and we typically just renew it when it comes due. So we've been collaborating with the Environment and Climate Change Canada for many years on that, and the actual monitoring station that we spoke about that detected the high levels to put the warning for the air quality index, that is one of the monitoring stations that's part of our agreement with Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're coming to the end. I've been told not to ask any more questions, but I'm not going to ask a question, but I'm just going to recap that you were going to endeavor to find me how many acres are currently encompassed in the Fish and Wildlife Development land and how many parcels, and then how much money was spent in the last fiscal year on fencing for Fish and Wildlife Development land, and then the tag numbers for whitetail, mule deer, elk, antelope, moose for 2022, 2023. Thank you.
All right, having reached our agreed upon time for consideration of these estimates, we'll proceed to vote on the estimates and supplementary estimates, number 2 for the Ministry of Environment. But before we begin the vote, Minister, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make.
Other than thank you to the ministry officials, thank you to, they provide a large backbone to the conversations that we have, and in their time here, and of course all the committee members. Thank you.
Awesome. Mr. Clark, if you have any closing remarks.
Echo the minister's statement. Thank you to the minister and to the deputy ministers and all the rest of folks here. Thank you very much. Sorry you had to put up with me for the last 2 hours, but appreciate your commitment to the environment in our province and all the good work that you do. Thank you to my colleagues for not heckling me during committee, putting up with me, as one member says, and thank you to the chair and Hansard and the clerks.
All right. Before we vote off the votes that are before us here this evening, Minister, you and officials are welcome to leave if you'd like. And we, as committee, will proceed with vote 26, Environment, found on page 43. Central Management and Services subvote EN01 in the amount of $14,559,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Climate Resilience subvote EN06 in the amount of $4,924,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Fish, Wildlife and Lands subvote EN01 in the amount of $19,238,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Forest Service subvote EN09 in the amount of $8,321,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Environmental Protection subvote EN 11 in the amount of $48,727,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Clean Electricity Transition subvote EN 19 in the amount of $140 million. Is that agreed? Carried. Non-appropriate expense adjustment in the amount of $870,000. Non-appropriate expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Environment, vote 26, $235,769,000. I will now ask, whoops. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for environment in the amount of $235,769,000. Mr. Francis so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Supplementary estimates, number 2, 2023-24, vote 26, environment, found on page 12. Environmental protection subvote EN 11 in the amount of $20,285,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Environment, vote 26, $20,285,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2024, the following sums for environment in the amount of $20,285,000. Mr. Harrison moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Does the committee agree with the voting off of the remainder of the estimates and supplementary estimates number 2 committed to this committee? Agreed. Carried. We will begin with vote 1, agriculture, found on page 27. Central management and services subvote AG01 in the amount of $12,584,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Industry assistance subvote AG03 in the amount of $4,726,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Land management subvote AG04 in the amount of $5,714,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Policy trade and value-added subvote AG05 in the amount of $5,946,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Research and technology subvote AG06 in the amount of $38,178,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Regional services subvote AG07 in the amount of $33,656,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Program subvote AG09 in the amount of $35,992,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Business risk management subvote AG10 in the amount of $431,700,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Non-appropriate expense adjustment in the amount of $2,087,000. Non-appropriate expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Agriculture, vote 1, $568,496,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolve that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for agriculture in the amount of $568,496,000. Mr. Dennis so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Vote 16, highways, found on page 71. Central management and services subvote HI01 in the amount of $19,469,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Preservation of transportation system subvote HI04 in the amount of $127,389,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Transportation planning and policy subvote HI06 in the amount of $4,454,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Infrastructure and Equipment Capital Subvote HI08 in the amount of $403,946,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Custom Work Activity Subvote HI09 in the amount of $0. Is that agreed? Carried. Operation of Transportation System Subvote HI10 in the amount of $156,288,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Strategic Municipal Infrastructure Subvote HI15 in the amount of $29,547,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Non-appropriate expense adjustment in the amount of $279,874,000. Non-appropriate expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Highways vote 16, $741,093,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for highways in the amount of $741,093,000. Mr. Francis so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Vote 89, Immigration and Career Training, found on page 77. Central Management and Services Subvote IC01 in the amount of $14,326,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Immigration, Employment, and Career Development Subvote IC02 in the amount of $13,724,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Training and Employer Services Subvote IC03 in the amount of $5,041,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Labor Market Program Subvote IC04 in the amount of $127,189,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Non-appropriate expense adjustment in the amount of $1,764,000. Non-appropriated expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Immigration and Career Training, vote 89, $160,280,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for immigration and career training in the amount of $160,280,000. Mr. Kirsch so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Vote 84, Innovation Saskatchewan, found on page 81. Innovation Saskatchewan, subvote IS01 in the amount of $31,042,000. Is that agreed? Carried. Innovation Saskatchewan, vote 84, $31,042,000.
Agreed.
Didn't ask for it. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for Innovation Saskatchewan in the amount of $31,042,000. Mr. Harrison so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Vote 35, Saskatchewan Research Council, found on page 99. Saskatchewan Research Council subvote SR01 in the amount of $41,623,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Saskatchewan Research Council, vote 35, $41,623,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for the Saskatchewan Research Council in the amount of $41,623,000. Mr. Dennis so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Vote 90, Trade and Export Development, found on page 115. Vote Central Management and Services subvote TE01 in the amount of $8,717,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Oops. Strategic Policy and Competitiveness subvote TE02 in the amount of $2,482,000. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Economic Development Subvote TE03 in the amount of $9,873,000. Is that agreed?
I agree.
Carried. I can't hear you, Mr. Dennis. International Engagement Subvote TE04 in the amount of $19,311,000. Is that agreed?
I agree.
Carried. That's better. Non-appropriated expense adjustment in the amount of $150,000. Non-appropriated expense adjustments are non-cash adjustments presented for informational purposes only. No amount is to be voted. Trade and Export Development, vote 90, $40,383,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for trade and export development in the amount of $40,383,000. Mr. Kirsch so moves. Is that agreed?
I agree.
Carried. I've got to get the right one here. Vote 87, Water Security Agency, found on page 119. Water Security Agency subvote WS01 in the amount of $103,638,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Water Security Agency, vote 87, $103,638,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2025, the following sums for Water Security Agency in the amount of $103,638,000. Mr. Francis so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. We're getting there. Supplementary estimates, number 2, 2023-24, vote 1, Agriculture, found on page 11. Business Risk Management, subvote AG10 in the amount of $86,321,000. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Agriculture, vote 1, $86,321,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2024, the following sums for agriculture in the amount of $86,321,000. Mr. Harrison so moves. Is that agreed?
I agree.
Carried. This is the 20, yep, okay. Vote 16, Highways, found on page 13. Operation of Transportation System, subvote HI-10 in the amount of $23,400,000. Is that agreed?
I agree.
Carried. Highways, vote 16, $23,400,000. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2024, the following sums for highways in the amount of $23,400,000. Is that agreed? Mr. Dennis so moves. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Vote 35, Saskatchewan Research Council, found on page 14. Saskatchewan Research Council, subvote SR01 in the amount of $5 million. Is that agreed?
I agree.
Carried. I will now ask a member, Saskatchewan Research Council, vote 35, $5 million. I will now ask a member to move the following resolution. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2024, the following sums for Saskatchewan Research Council in the amount of $5 million. Mr. Kirsch so moves. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. Yep. Pretty soon. Almost there, folks. Pretty good. 15 minutes. Committee members. Committee members. You have before you a draft of the 7th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy. We require a member to move the following motion: that the 7th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be adopted and presented to the Assembly. I recognize Mr. Francis.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I move that the 7th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be adopted and presented to the Assembly.
Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Carried. I gotta think. One more. So this one you just sign. All right. That concludes the committee's business for this evening, and I would ask a member to move a motion of adjournment. Mr. Harrison so moves. Is all agreed? Carried. This committee stands adjourned to the call of the chair.